Welcome to a chilling journey through the forgotten corners of American history, where the echoes of injustice still whisper through the Alabama fog. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more spine-tingling historical mysteries. The autumn mist clung to Blackwood Plantation like a shroud, its tendrils weaving between the weathered headstones of the old slave cemetery. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her recording equipment, the digital display casting an eerie blue glow across her weathered face. At 42, she had investigated dozens of historical sites across the South, but something about this place felt different, heavier, as if the very air carried the weight of untold stories. Recording begins, October 15th, 2023. Blackwood Plantation investigation. Day 1. She spoke into her device, her breath visible in the cool evening air. Present are Dr. Sarah Mitchell, historian, Marcus Washington, genealogist, and Elena Rodriguez, archaeological surveyor. Marcus, a tall man in his 30s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, knelt beside a crumbling headstone. His fingers traced the barely legible inscription with reverence. "Sarah, you need to see this," he called softly. "The dates don't match the plantation records." Elena looked up from her ground-penetrating radar equipment, her dark hair escaping from beneath her cap. "What do you mean?" "According to the historical documents, this cemetery was abandoned in 1863 when the plantation was sold," Marcus explained, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "But this grave... It's dated 1867, and this one here, 1871. Sarah approached, her boots crunching on the fallen leaves. The headstone Marcus indicated was simple, unmarked except for the date and a single word, Ezekiel. Below it, carved in rough letters, were the words, "He who walks between worlds." "That's impossible," Sarah murmured, pulling out her tablet to cross-reference the plantation records. "The property was converted to a cotton mill by 1865. No one should have been buried here after the war ended." A sudden gust of wind swept through the cemetery, causing the ancient oak trees to groan and sway. The sound was almost like voices, whispered conversations in a language none of them could understand. Elena shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "Local folklore mentions a man named Ezekiel," Marcus said, consulting his notes. "The stories are unusual. They say he survived things that should have killed him. Fires, floods, even a lightning strike that split an oak tree right down the middle." "Folklore often exaggerates," Sarah replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "We need to focus on documented facts." But as she spoke, her tablet screen flickered and went dark. She pressed the power button repeatedly, but the device remained unresponsive. "That's strange. It was fully charged." Elena's radar equipment began emitting a low, rhythmic beeping. She frowned at the display, tapping the screen. "I'm getting readings that don't make sense. There are voids, empty spaces where there should be soil." "Underground chambers?" Sarah suggested. "Maybe, but they're arranged in a pattern, almost like—" Elena paused, studying the readout more carefully. "Like they're following the layout of the graves above ground." Marcus stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "There's something else. I've been researching the plantation's final years, and there are gaps in the records. Months where no entries were made, no transactions recorded. It's as if the place just stopped existing for periods of time." The mist seemed to thicken around them, reducing visibility to just a few yards. In the distance, the silhouette of the old plantation house loomed against the darkening sky, its broken windows like hollow eyes watching their every move. "We should head back to town," Elena suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can review the data and plan tomorrow's investigation." But as they gathered their equipment, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Fresh flowers lay on Ezekiel's grave, white lilies, that couldn't have been there more than a day or two. The petals were still pristine, untouched by the autumn weather. "Who would leave flowers on a grave that's over 150 years old?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Marcus and Elena exchanged glances. The cemetery was miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that showed no recent tire tracks. As they walked back toward their vehicle, none of them noticed the figure standing in the shadow of the plantation house, watching them with eyes that had seen more than a century of secrets. The man was tall and lean, his clothes simple but well-maintained, and around his neck hung a small leather pouch that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Ezekiel had been waiting for them. The night deepened as the three researchers drove back to town, each lost in their own thoughts about the day's disturbing discoveries. What they didn't know was that their presence had awakened something that had been dormant for decades, something that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal its secrets. At Blackwood Plantation, Ezekiel remained in the cemetery until the early hours of morning, tending to the graves with the care of someone who had performed this same task for over a century. His hands, which appeared young but carried the wisdom of ages, touched each headstone with reverence, whispering names that had long been forgotten by the world. He knew the researchers would return. They always did, those who sought the truth. And this time, perhaps, just perhaps, he could finally share the burden he had carried alone for so long. The night wind carried with it the echo of work songs long silenced, the laments of mothers who had lost children, and the whispered prayers of souls who had found peace only in death. Ezekiel knew each of these voices, for he had been witness to their lives and guardian of their memories. As dawn approached, he retreated to the small cabin that had been his home for longer than any place should be home to a man. There, surrounded by artifacts from an era the world had chosen to forget, he would wait for the researchers' return, knowing that when they came back, everything would change forever. The morning brought with it a sense of unease that settled over the three investigators like a heavy blanket. Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on her usual research, her mind constantly drifting back to the image of those fresh white lilies on a grave that should have been forgotten by time. She spent hours poring over historical documents, searching for any mention of unusual phenomena at Blackwood Plantation, but the official records remained frustratingly silent on such matters. Marcus spent hours poring over genealogical databases, searching for any mention of Ezekiel beyond the plantation records. What he found only deepened the mystery. There were references to a man matching Ezekiel's description in documents spanning nearly a century, always the same age, always described in terms that suggested something beyond normal human experience. Census records from 1870, 1880, and even 1890 listed an Ezekiel living in the vicinity of the plantation, but the physical descriptions never changed. Male, Negro, approximately 30 years of age, unmarked by time. Eleanor ran and reran her ground-penetrating radar data, trying to make sense of the underground chambers she had detected. The more she studied the readings, the more convinced she became that they were looking at something far older and more complex than a simple burial ground. The chambers appeared to be interconnected by a sophisticated network of tunnels, some of which extended far beyond the boundaries of the cemetery itself. Most disturbing of all, her equipment had detected what appeared to be recent disturbances in some of the deeper chambers, as if something had been moving through them in the past few weeks. By evening, they had made a collective decision. They would return to Blackwood Plantation that night, armed with more sophisticated equipment and a determination to uncover the truth, no matter how unsettling it might prove to be. Sarah had contacted colleagues at 3 different universities, requesting any information they might have about paranormal phenomena in the antebellum South. The responses she received were both fascinating and terrifying. Stories of plantations where the dead refused to rest, of slaves who had made pacts with forces beyond human understanding, and of places where the very fabric of reality seemed thin and permeable. As they prepared for their second visit, none of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched. In coffee shops, on street corners, even in their hotel rooms, there seemed to be shadows that moved independently of their sources, whispers that carried no words, and the persistent scent of white lilies that had no earthly origin. Elena's electromagnetic field detector, which she had brought with her to test, registered constant fluctuations throughout the day, as if some invisible presence was following them wherever they went. The truth was waiting for them at Blackwood Plantation. But it was a truth that would challenge everything they thought they knew about life, death, and the thin veil that separates the two. And at the center of it all stood Ezekiel, a man who had made a choice so profound that it had bound him to a fate beyond mortal understanding. As the sun set over Alabama and they prepared to return to the plantation, each of them wondered if they were about to cross a line from which there would be no return. The Magnolia Inn sat on the outskirts of Millbrook, Alabama, its wraparound porch and white columns a testament to Southern hospitality. But tonight, the charm felt hollow to Sarah as she stared at her laptop screen in the small hotel room. The data from their first day at Blackwood Plantation defied every logical explanation she could muster. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Marcus and Elena entered, both carrying steaming cups of coffee and expressions of bewilderment. "I've been going through the genealogical records," Marcus began, settling into the room's single armchair. "Ezekiel's story is complicated. He was born around 1820, purchased by the Blackwood family when he was 15. But here's where it gets strange. Every record I can find describes him as peculiar or touched by something beyond understanding." Elena pulled up a chair, her laptop balanced on her knees. "The ground-penetrating radar results are even more confusing. Those voids I detected, they're not natural. Someone deliberately created underground chambers, and they're all connected by a network of tunnels." Sarah rubbed her temples, feeling the beginning of a headache. "Let's focus on what we can verify. Marcus, what do the plantation records say about Ezekiel specifically?" Marcus opened his notebook, pages filled with meticulous handwriting. "The first mention is from 1835. The plantation owner, Jeremiah Blackwood, wrote, 'The boy Ezekiel continues to unsettle the other slaves. Yesterday, lightning struck the field where he was working, killing the mule beside him but leaving him untouched. The others whisper of dark magic, but I see only God's protection of the innocent.'" "That could be coincidence," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps. But listen to this entry from 1841. A fire consumed the slave quarters last night. 17 souls lost, but Ezekiel emerged from the flames without so much as singed clothing. The other slaves refuse to work alongside him, claiming he brings death to all but himself. I have moved him to the isolated cabin by the cemetery." Elena looked up from her laptop. "The isolated cabin. I think I found it on the old survey maps. It's about 50 yards from where we were working today." "There's more," Marcus continued. "In 1847, Jeremiah's son, Thomas, took over the plantation. His entries are darker. He writes about Ezekiel's unnatural longevity and his ability to commune with the departed. Thomas believed Ezekiel was making deals with forces beyond human understanding." Sarah stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the dark Alabama countryside. "Even if we accept that Ezekiel was somehow different, that doesn't explain the recent graves or the fresh flowers." "Actually, it might," Elena said quietly. "I did some research on local disappearances. Over the past 50 years, 7 people have vanished near Blackwood Plantation. Hikers, researchers, even a few teenagers looking for a thrill. None of them were ever found." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Marcus cleared his throat. There's something else. I found a letter from 1863, written by a Union soldier who was part of the force that liberated the plantation. He describes finding Ezekiel in the cemetery, tending to graves that appeared fresh, despite the plantation being abandoned for months. The soldier wrote that Ezekiel looked exactly as he had 20 years earlier, not a day older. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered, but even as she said it, she remembered the figure she thought she'd glimpsed in the shadows of the plantation house. Elena's laptop chimed with an incoming email. She opened it, her face growing pale as she read. "It's from the county coroner's office. I requested information about any recent deaths in the area." She paused, her hands trembling slightly. 3 people have died in the past month, all within a 5-mile radius of Blackwood Plantation. Natural causes according to the reports, but what? Sarah asked. They were all found with white lilies in their hands. Fresh white lilies, just like the ones on Ezekiel's grave. The 3 researchers stared at each other, the weight of their discovery settling over them like a suffocating blanket. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying with it the faint sound of singing, a low, mournful melody that seemed to come from the direction of the plantation. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. "We're going back tomorrow night. Whatever's happening at Blackwood Plantation, we need to understand it. People are dying, and if there's even a chance that Ezekiel is somehow involved." She didn't finish the sentence, but they all understood. Some mysteries demanded answers, no matter how terrifying those answers might be. As they prepared to leave Sarah's room, none of them noticed the tall figure standing beneath the streetlight outside the inn. Ezekiel watched them through the window, his ageless face etched with an expression of profound sadness. In his hand, he held a single white lily, its petals glowing softly in the darkness. The time for hiding was nearly over. That night, as the researchers tried to sleep, each was visited by vivid and disturbing dreams. Sarah dreamed of fields on fire and the sound of chains dragging across the earth. She saw faces in the flames, men, women, and children whose names had been lost to history, but whose suffering echoed through time. In her dream, she walked through the burning fields, feeling the heat on her skin, but unable to help the figures who reached out to her with desperate hands. Marcus saw faces of people long dead, their eyes pleading for justice that never came. He found himself in a courtroom that existed outside of time, where the testimonies of the enslaved were finally being heard. But as each witness spoke, their words turned to ash in their mouths, and Marcus realized that some truths were too painful for the world to bear. He woke with tears on his cheeks and the taste of smoke in his mouth. Elena felt the weight of earth above her, as if she were buried alive in one of the underground chambers she had detected. In her dream, she could hear voices calling to her from the darkness, voices of those who had been buried without ceremony, without recognition, without even the dignity of a marked grave. She tried to dig her way to them, but the earth kept shifting, and she realized that she was not trapped in the ground but suspended between worlds, caught in the liminal space where the living and the dead intersected. But they were more than dreams. They were memories, memories of a land stained with blood and tears, of lives lost and souls forgotten, and at the center of it all a solitary figure who had witnessed every tragedy, every injustice, carrying the burden of protecting the living from the restless dead. When they awoke the next morning, all 3 knew there was no turning back. They had crossed an invisible line, and now they were part of the story they were trying to unravel. The only question that remained was whether they would have the courage to face the truth when it finally revealed itself. The day passed slowly, each hour bringing them closer to their return to Blackwood Plantation. Sarah spent the morning in the local library, researching Cherokee history and burial practices. What she found only added to her growing sense of unease. The Cherokee had indeed lived in the area for centuries before European colonization, and their burial grounds were considered sacred, protected by powerful spiritual forces. According to the historical accounts, the Cherokee had developed sophisticated methods for containing and channeling supernatural energies, treating them not as evil forces to be destroyed, but as natural phenomena to be understood and controlled. Marcus contacted historians at several universities, trying to find any academic papers or studies that might shed light on the unusual phenomena they had witnessed. Most of his colleagues dismissed his inquiries as folklore and superstition, but a few mentioned similar cases, places where the boundary between the living and the dead seemed unusually thin. One professor at Tulane University sent him a collection of unpublished papers about liminal spaces in the antebellum South, places where traumatic events had left permanent scars on the fabric of reality itself. Elena spent the day calibrating her equipment and researching electromagnetic anomalies. She discovered that certain geological formations could create conditions that amplified psychic phenomena, and that underground water sources often played a role in such manifestations. More disturbing still, she found references to energy vampires, entities that fed on human life force and could manipulate electromagnetic fields to their advantage. As evening approached, they gathered in Sarah's hotel room to plan their strategy for the night ahead. They would bring additional recording equipment, electromagnetic field detectors, and thermal imaging cameras. If Ezekiel appeared again, they would be ready to document every detail of the encounter. But even as they made their preparations, each of them wondered if they were making a terrible mistake. The stories Marcus had uncovered suggested that those who delved too deeply into Ezekiel's mystery often paid a heavy price. Yet the historian in Sarah, the genealogist in Marcus, and the scientist in Elena all demanded answers, regardless of the personal cost. The next evening brought with it an oppressive humidity that seemed to press against their skin like a living thing. Sarah, Marcus, and Elena returned to Blackwood Plantation as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and amber. This time, they came prepared with additional equipment: night vision cameras, motion sensors, and a portable generator to power their investigation through the night. "The temperature's dropped 15 degrees since we arrived," Eleanor observed, checking her instruments. "That's not normal for this time of year." Marcus was setting up his genealogical research station near Ezekiel's grave, his laptop connected to a satellite internet link. "I've been in contact with the Alabama Department of Archives. They're sending over some documents that were recently discovered in a private collection, papers that belonged to Thomas Blackwood himself." Sarah adjusted her night vision camera, scanning the cemetery through its green-tinted display. "I want to document everything tonight. If Ezekiel is somehow still active, we need proof." As if summoned by his name, a figure emerged from the mist near the old plantation house. Tall and lean, dressed in simple work clothes that seemed to belong to another era, the man walked with purpose toward the cemetery. In the green glow of Sarah's camera, his face was clearly visible, ageless, marked by profound sadness, and undeniably real. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her hands trembling as she adjusted the camera focus. "He's actually here." Ezekiel approached them slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades, rich and deep, with a slight accent that spoke of origins far from Alabama. "You seek answers," he said, stopping about 10 feet away from their equipment. "But are you prepared for the truth?" Marcus nearly dropped his laptop. You're really him, Ezekiel." "I am." The man's eyes, ancient beyond his apparent years, fixed on each of them in turn. "And you are the ones who have been disturbing the peace of this place." Elena found her voice first. The graves, the recent ones. Did you? I tend to those who come here seeking what they should not seek, Ezekiel replied. This land holds a covenant, made in blood and desperation. I am its guardian, bound by choices made long ago. Sarah stepped forward, her camera still recording. What kind of covenant? Ezekiel's expression grew even more sorrowful. In 1847, Thomas Blackwood discovered something in these woods, an ancient burial ground that predated his plantation by centuries. The Cherokee who once lived here had sealed something away, something that fed on suffering and death. Thomas, in his greed and ignorance, broke those seals. Oh, the wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of distant drums and chanting. The researchers looked around nervously, but Ezekiel remained calm. "What was sealed away?" Marcus asked, his academic curiosity overriding his fear. "A hunger," Ezekiel said simply, "an entity that grows stronger with each life it claims, each soul it devours." When Thomas broke the seals, it began to feed on the plantation, the slaves, the animals, even the land itself. Crops failed, people sickened and died, and the very earth turned sour. Elena's equipment began registering massive electromagnetic fluctuations. The underground chambers, they're part of the original burial ground? The Cherokee built them as a prison, Ezekiel confirmed. But Thomas's actions weakened the barriers. By 1850, the entity was strong enough to manifest physically. It would have consumed everything within 100 miles, if not for... He paused, his hand moving to the leather pouch around his neck. "If not for what?" Sarah pressed. "A bargain," Ezekiel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I offered myself as a permanent guardian, bound to this place until the entity could be properly contained again. In exchange, it would feed only on those who came here seeking to exploit or disturb the dead." Marcus's laptop chimed with an incoming message. He glanced at the screen, his face going pale. "The documents from the Alabama archives, they just came through. There's a letter here from Thomas Blackwood dated 1863. He writes about making a devil's bargain with one of his slaves to prevent a catastrophe that would consume the entire state." "Thomas understood, eventually," Ezekiel said. "But by then, it was too late for him. The entity had already marked him. He died 3 days after writing that letter." Sarah lowered her camera, the full implications of what they were hearing beginning to sink in. "The people who've died recently, they came here looking for treasure, artifacts. Grave robbers mostly, treasure hunters who heard stories of Cherokee gold buried in these woods. The entity feeds on their greed, their disrespect for the dead." Ezekiel's eyes fixed on Sarah. "But you three are different. You came seeking knowledge, not profit. That is why I reveal myself to you." Elena's voice was barely a whisper. "How long have you been here? How long have you been like this?" 176 years, Ezekiel replied. "I have watched the world change around me, seen generations come and go. I have tended these graves, maintained the barriers, and ensured that the entity remains contained." "But at what cost?" Sarah asked, her heart breaking for this man who had sacrificed everything. Ezekiel smiled sadly. "The cost of preventing something far worse. But the barriers are weakening again. The entity grows stronger with each passing year, and I—" He touched the pouch around his neck again. "I grow weary." A low rumble emanated from the ground beneath their feet, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. In the distance, the plantation house seemed to pulse with a malevolent red light. "It knows you are here," Ezekiel said urgently. "It knows you have learned the truth. You must leave now, before it decides you are a threat." But even as he spoke, Sarah knew they couldn't simply walk away. Not now, not when they finally understood the magnitude of what Ezekiel had been protecting them all from. "There has to be another way," she said. "Some way to help you, to strengthen the barriers permanently." Ezekiel looked at her with something that might have been hope. "Perhaps, but it would require a sacrifice that I cannot ask of anyone." The rumbling grew stronger, and cracks began to appear in the ground around the oldest graves. Whatever was imprisoned beneath Blackwood Plantation was stirring, and time was running out. But there was something more that Ezekiel hadn't told them, something about the true nature of the entity and the real price of keeping it contained. As the cracks spread and the earth began to tremble, he knew that the moment of final revelation had come. "There is something more you must know," he said, his voice struggling against the growing rumble. "The entity. It is not merely a destructive force, it is also a source of knowledge, of power that could benefit humanity if properly channeled. The Cherokee knew this. That is why they did not destroy it. They imprisoned it, hoping to find a way to use its strength for good." Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her as she watched this man who had given up everything to protect others. "Tell us what to do." The rumbling became deafening, and the earth itself began to split, revealing glimpses of the ancient chambers below. But amid the chaos, a new possibility was being born, a chance not just to contain the entity, but to transform its destructive hunger into something that could heal the wounds it had caused. As the ground continued to crack and the red light from the plantation house grew brighter, Ezekiel began to speak of the ritual that could change everything, a ceremony that would require not one guardian, but 7, each representing one of the sacred directions recognized by the Cherokee. It would mean binding themselves to this place, accepting a responsibility that would last for generations. But it would also mean transforming a force of destruction into one of healing and growth. The choice was theirs, but they had to make it quickly. The entity was awakening, and if they couldn't contain it soon, it would break free of its prison and consume everything in its path. The fate of not just Blackwood Plantation, but the entire region hung in the balance, and at the center of it all stood Ezekiel, a man who had already sacrificed everything, waiting to see if others would be willing to share the burden he had carried alone for so long. The time for hiding was over. The time for truth had come. As the cracks in the earth widened, revealing more of the ancient Cherokee chambers below, Ezekiel began to explain the full scope of what they were facing. The entity wasn't just a mindless force of destruction. It was an ancient consciousness, older than human civilization, that had been drawn to this place by the suffering and death that had occurred here over the centuries. The Cherokee had understood its nature and had developed rituals to contain and channel its power, but the arrival of European settlers had disrupted their careful balance. The Cherokee called it Nvhi Atsila, the hungry shadow, Ezekiel explained, his voice barely audible over the growing rumble from below. They knew that it could not be destroyed, only redirected. For generations, they used its power to protect their lands, to ensure good harvests, to heal the sick, but it required constant vigilance, constant sacrifice. The red light from the plantation house grew brighter, and Sarah could see shapes moving in the windows, shadows that seemed to have substance and purpose. The entity was testing the boundaries of its prison, probing for weaknesses in the barriers that had held it for so long. When Thomas Blackwood broke the seals, he didn't understand what he was unleashing, Ezekiel continued. He thought he was simply clearing land for his plantation. But the entity began to feed on the suffering of the enslaved, growing stronger with each act of cruelty, each life lost to brutality and despair. Marcus looked up from his laptop, his face pale in the green glow of the night vision equipment. The documents mention something called the 7 sacred directions. What does that mean? North, south, east, west, above, below, and within, Ezekiel replied. Each direction represents a different aspect of existence, a different way of understanding the balance between life and death, creation and destruction. The ritual requires 7 guardians, each attuned to one of these directions, working together to maintain the balance. Elena's equipment was registering energy levels that should have been impossible. The electromagnetic readings are off the charts. Whatever's down there, it's trying to break free. The earth beneath Blackwood Plantation shuddered, as if something immense was trying to claw its way to the surface. Sarah, Marcus, and Elena stood frozen as the ancient Cherokee burial chambers began to collapse, their carefully constructed barriers finally succumbing to more than a century of pressure from the entity trapped below. Ezekiel moved with sudden urgency, pulling items from his leather pouch, small bones, carved stones, and what appeared to be dried herbs. "The primary seal is failing," he said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "I can reinforce it, but only temporarily." "What do you need us to do?" Sarah asked, her camera forgotten as she watched cracks spread across the cemetery like a spider's web. "Stay back," Ezekiel commanded, beginning to arrange the items in a complex pattern around his own grave. "The entity will try to use you against me. It feeds on fear, on desperation, on the desire to live." But Marcus was already pulling up files on his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Wait, I found something in Thomas Blackwood's papers. A reference to a restoration ritual that the Cherokee elder taught him before he died. It mentions multiple guardians, a sharing of the burden." Eleanor's equipment was going haywire, registering energy levels that shouldn't have been possible. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts. Whatever's down there, it's massive." The ground split open near the plantation house, revealing a glimpse of the chambers below, carved stone corridors that seemed to stretch into infinite darkness. From that darkness came a sound like 1,000 voices screaming in unison, a cacophony of rage and hunger that had been building for nearly 2 centuries. "The Cherokee knew this day would come," Ezekiel said, his hands moving in precise patterns as he worked to strengthen the failing seals. "They prepared for it, but the ritual requires willing participants, people who understand the cost." Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her as she watched this man who had given up everything to protect others. "Tell us what to do." "Sarah, no," Elena protested. "We don't know what we're getting into." "Did they?" But Marcus was already reading from the documents on his screen. "The ritual doesn't require permanent guardianship. It creates a network, multiple people sharing the responsibility, the burden distributed among them. The entity would be contained, but no one person would have to bear the full weight." Ezekiel paused in his work, hope flickering in his ancient eyes. "You would be bound to this place, required to return periodically to maintain the seals. Your lives would be longer than normal, but not eternal. And when you grew old, you would need to find others to take your place." The screaming from below grew louder, and tendrils of shadow began seeping from the cracks in the earth. Where they touched, the grass withered and died instantly. "How many people?" Sarah asked. 7, Ezekiel replied. 7 guardians representing the 7 sacred directions of the Cherokee. With you 3 and myself, we would need 3 more. Elena was frantically typing on her phone. "I'm calling my colleagues at the university, Dr. Patterson, Dr. Kim, and Professor Williams. They're all here in Alabama for the archaeological conference. If I can reach them." "They would have to come willingly," Ezekiel warned. "The ritual cannot be forced." As Elena made her calls, Marcus continued reading from the Cherokee documents. "There's more here about the entity. It's not evil in the traditional sense. It's more like a force of nature, a cosmic balance. It feeds on death and suffering because that's its purpose. But it can be redirected, channeled into something constructive." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "The Cherokee used it to enrich their lands, to ensure good harvests and healthy children. But it requires constant guidance, constant vigilance. That's why they built the prison, not to destroy it, but to control it until they could find a better way." Elena's phone calls were successful. Within an hour, 3 more researchers had arrived at Blackwood Plantation: Dr. Patricia Patterson, a specialist in Native American history; Dr. James Kim, an expert in geological formations; and Professor Robert Williams, who had spent decades studying Southern folklore and oral traditions. As Ezekiel explained the situation to the newcomers, Sarah found herself thinking about the implications of what they were about to do. They would be bound to this place, responsible for maintaining a balance that had existed for centuries. It was a huge commitment, but it was also an opportunity to preserve something important, not just the safety of the surrounding area, but a piece of history that connected them to the indigenous people who had first understood the true nature of this land. "Are we all in agreement?" Ezekiel asked, as the 7 of them stood in a circle around the failing seals. One by one, they nodded. Dr. Patterson spoke for all of them. "We understand the responsibility. We accept it willingly." The ritual itself was surprisingly simple. Each person placed their hand on one of the carved stones Ezekiel had arranged, speaking their name and their commitment to the guardianship. As they did, the stones began to glow with a soft, warm light that pushed back the shadows seeping from the cracks in the earth. Sarah felt the change immediately, a sense of connection not just to the other guardians, but to the land itself. She could feel the entity below, no longer a source of terror, but something that could be understood, guided, even befriended. "It's working," Dr. Kim said, his voice filled with wonder. "The seismic activity is stabilizing." The cracks in the earth began to seal themselves, and the screaming from below faded to a whisper, then to silence. The red light emanating from the plantation house dimmed and disappeared, replaced by the normal darkness of a southern night. Ezekiel straightened, and for the first time since they'd met him, he smiled. The burden is shared now. The entity is contained, but more than that, it's understood. We can work with it, learn from it, ensure that it serves life rather than consuming it. Over the following months, the 7 guardians developed a system. They took turns visiting Blackwood Plantation, monitoring the seals, and gradually learning to communicate with the entity they now protected. What they discovered changed their understanding of history, of the relationship between indigenous peoples and the land, and of their own responsibility as scholars and researchers. The plantation became a research center, a place where the boundaries between science and spirituality blurred in productive ways. The entity, no longer starved and desperate, began to share its knowledge, insights into the natural world that led to breakthroughs in agriculture, medicine, and environmental science. Sarah often found herself standing in the cemetery at sunset, watching Ezekiel tend to the graves with a peace she had never seen in him before. The fresh flowers on the headstones were no longer markers of death, but symbols of remembrance and respect. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked him one evening. Ezekiel considered the question carefully. "I regret the loneliness, the isolation, but not the choice itself. Some responsibilities are too important to abandon, even when the cost is high." Sarah nodded, understanding. They had all made sacrifices to become guardians, but they had also gained something invaluable, a connection to something larger than themselves, a purpose that would outlast their individual lives. As the years passed, the 7 guardians aged more slowly than normal, their lifespans extended by their connection to the entity. When the time came, they carefully selected and trained their replacements, ensuring that the knowledge and responsibility would continue. But the story didn't end there. The network of guardians grew, spreading to other locations where similar forces had been imprisoned or forgotten. They became a secret society of scholars and researchers, dedicated to protecting and understanding the ancient mysteries that still influence the modern world. Dr. Patterson established a Native American studies program that became a model for universities across the country. Her research into Cherokee spiritual practices led to a renaissance of interest in indigenous knowledge systems, and her work helped bridge the gap between traditional wisdom and modern science. She discovered that many of the techniques the Cherokee had used to channel supernatural forces had practical applications in fields ranging from renewable energy to psychological healing. Dr. Kim developed new geological monitoring techniques that revolutionized early earthquake detection. His understanding of the underground chambers at Blackwood Plantation led to breakthroughs in seismic engineering and the development of early warning systems that saved thousands of lives. He also pioneered new methods for detecting and mapping underground water sources, helping communities around the world access clean drinking water. Professor Williams wrote a series of books on Southern folklore that brought new understanding to oral traditions that had been ignored for too long. His work helped preserve stories and songs that might otherwise have been lost, and his research into the connections between folklore and historical fact opened up new avenues of study for historians and anthropologists. He established oral history projects in dozens of communities, ensuring that the voices of the marginalized would be heard and remembered. Marcus became the network's chief genealogist, tracing family lineages and personal histories that connected the present to the past in ways no one had imagined. His work helped reunite families separated by slavery and migration, and his databases became invaluable resources for researchers studying the African American experience. He also developed new techniques for DNA analysis that could trace ancestry back hundreds of years, giving people connections to their heritage that had been thought lost forever. Elena developed radar technologies that could detect not just physical structures, but energy anomalies that indicated the presence of supernatural forces. Her innovations led to the discovery of dozens of similar sites around the world, places where ancient forces had been contained or channeled by indigenous peoples. Her work became the foundation for a new field of study that combined archaeology with paranormal investigation, opening up entirely new ways of understanding human history. And Sarah, she became the network's official chronicler, documenting their discoveries and ensuring that the lessons learned at Blackwood Plantation would never be forgotten. Her reports became the foundation for a new field of study, paranormal archaeology, that combined rigorous scientific methods with openness to phenomena that traditional science couldn't explain. She wrote extensively about the need to respect indigenous knowledge systems and the importance of understanding history from multiple perspectives. The entity beneath Blackwood Plantation became not just contained, but integrated. Its hunger was redirected to consume pollution and toxins, cleaning the land that had been stained by centuries of abuse. Its strength was channeled to heal, to nurture, to protect. The plantation's soil, once poisoned by the suffering that had occurred there, became incredibly fertile, producing crops that were not only abundant, but also possessed unusual nutritional properties. The cemetery flourished as never before. The graves, once markers of tragedy and injustice, became gardens of memory where visitors came to learn about the real history of the South, not the romanticized version that had been taught for generations, but the complex and painful truth that included both suffering and resistance, both loss and hope. Each headstone was restored and properly marked, and the stories of those buried there were researched and recorded, giving names and histories to people who had been forgotten by time. Ezekiel, finally free from the solitary burden he had carried for so long, became a teacher and guide. He shared his memories with historians, his experiences with scientists, his wisdom with anyone willing to listen. His unnatural longevity became a blessing instead of a curse, allowing him to serve as a living bridge between past and present. He worked with linguists to preserve African languages and dialects that had been brought to America by enslaved people, and he helped anthropologists understand the complex cultural exchanges that had occurred on plantations throughout the South. But perhaps the most significant change was in the local community itself. The people of Millbrook and the surrounding towns, who had once avoided Blackwood Plantation out of fear and superstition, began to see it as a place of healing and learning. African-American families came to honor their ancestors, finding peace and closure that had been denied for generations. White families came to confront the difficult truths about their own heritage, learning about the real cost of the wealth and privilege their ancestors had enjoyed. The plantation house was restored, not as a monument to Southern grandeur, but as a museum that told the complete story, including the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. Interactive exhibits allowed visitors to experience plantation life through the eyes of both the enslaved and the enslavers, promoting understanding and empathy instead of division and hatred. The museum became a model for how historical sites could address difficult truths while promoting healing and reconciliation. The macabre mystery of Ezekiel had been solved, but it had revealed something far more profound than a simple ghost story. It had shown them that some mysteries are meant to be embraced rather than solved, that some responsibilities are too important to abandon, and that the true measure of a person is not how long they live, but how willingly they serve something greater than themselves. In the end, Ezekiel's curse had become a blessing, not just for him, but for all those who chose to share in the sacred duty of guardianship. The entity that had once threatened to consume everything now served as a bridge between worlds, a reminder that even the darkest forces can be transformed through understanding, respect, and sacrifice. The cemetery at Blackwood Plantation remains active to this day, tended by guardians who understand that some stories never truly end. They simply find new chapters, new voices to carry them forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. And on quiet nights, when the mist rises from the fields and the moon shines through the ancient oaks, sensitive visitors can still hear the echoes of work songs, the whisper of prayers, and the soft sound of footsteps from someone who continues to walk between worlds, ensuring that the dead rest in peace and that the living remember the lessons of the past. Ezekiel's story became legend, but a legend based on truth, a truth that continues to influence and inspire all those brave enough to face the mysteries that lie buried in American history. And perhaps in the end, that is the greatest lesson of all, that true courage lies not in avoiding the unknown, but in embracing it, learning from it, and using it to build a better world for future generations. The network of guardians continues to grow, with new members joining each year as they discover sites where ancient forces still influence the modern world. They work in secret, protecting humanity from dangers it doesn't understand, while preserving knowledge that could benefit all mankind. Their work has led to breakthroughs in renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and environmental restoration. The entity at Blackwood Plantation, once a source of death and destruction, now powers research that could help heal the planet itself. And at the center of it all, Ezekiel continues his vigil, no longer alone, but surrounded by others who share his commitment to protecting the balance between the seen and unseen worlds. His sacrifice, once a burden too heavy for any one person to bear, has become a shared responsibility that strengthens with each passing year. The macabre mystery of the most cursed slave in Alabama's history has become a story of redemption, transformation, and hope. It reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of human history, there are those willing to sacrifice everything to protect others, and that their courage can inspire generations to come. If this story moved you, subscribe for more untold mysteries from America's hidden history. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe some mysteries are meant to be embraced rather than solved? Hit that like button and let's explore the unknown together.